Welcome to Future Ready Live, where we talk about topics that will help CPAs, CGMAs, finance and accounting pros prepare for change and transformation. Today, we're going to be talking about the Great Resignation, resistance to change, learning, and the brain. And joining me is Dr. Britt Andreatta, PhD. Britt is an internationally recognized thought leader who creates brain science-based solutions for today's challenges. As the CEO of Seventh Mind Inc., Britt draws on her unique background in leadership, neuroscience, psychology, and learning to unlock the best in people and organizations. She's the former Chief Learning Officer for lynda.com and Senior Learning Consultant for Global Leadership and Talent Development at LinkedIn. She's a seasoned professional with more than 25 years of experience. Now, I met Britt at the Association Digital Now conference, where she keynoted in 2016 and 2017. And I've been inspired by your talks. I love your books, and I'm so glad to get to spend some time with you today. Britt, say hello to everybody.
Thank you, Tom. I'm excited to be part of this conversation and connect with your followers as well.
It's awesome to see you again and talk about this stuff, because it's funny. Back then, it was some pretty interesting stuff. I have a feeling it's a lot more interesting right now and what we're dealing with. So let's get it started. We're going to start with the Great Resignation and the fact that our CFO community has called the war for talent recently obscene and nuclear, and it's risen to the top issue facing corporate finance and accounting teams. How did we get here?
Well, we're really living through this perfect storm of several factors that came together that have just created this mess that we're in. It's also called the Great Shuffle, since people are leaving one job and joining another company elsewhere. But the things that have contributed to it, really, obviously, one is the pandemic. It's a literal threat to people's survival. And it's a natural disaster that has gone on much longer than natural disasters normally do. We're actually biologically wired to be able to kind of dig into our reserves to get through like a flood or a hurricane or something. And typically 6 months is when the community really starts to recover. But this has just gone on, and it's driving this really high level of burnout and exhaustion. And it also has contributed to people wanting to have some sense of control in their life. And the only two things they can really control is where they work and where they live. So it's driving both the Great Resignation as well as the massive shift in housing and the move from urban areas. The second factor is that while work from home has been a blessing, it's also been a curse. So it has resoundingly changed what we mean by a workplace and how work gets done. And it's really highlighted that a lot of the assumptions we had about a physical workplace have been wrong all along, but now it's just kind of gotten exposed. People have been using the last 18 months, their commuting time was gone. So they've been putting that into like doing yoga or spending more time with their family. They have found that they're happier working with their cat sitting on their lap or being surrounded by their furniture and their favorite foods. And it also exposed companies who had built their culture, and I put culture in air quotes, around having a cool workplace. So the companies, and the phrase I use is the companies who invested in fun furniture and free food, but that's really all they had invested in, they've been horribly exposed. Where companies that had invested in a culture where people truly felt respected, that they were invested in with learning and growing opportunities, those companies are seeing less of this turnover than the companies where the culture really didn't live in anything other than a perk that disappeared. And then I would also say that even the work from home conversation highlighted these two very different workforces. I happen to be part of the workforce that's privileged enough to be able to choose to get to work from home. I didn't have to go into an unsafe environment to keep my job. But a lot of these essential workers, and I'm putting that in air quotes because while we call them essential, we don't treat them with the respect and the dignity that they deserve. They're usually the lowest paid jobs. A lot of them had to go into what was very threatening work environments where they could get sick. And even now that we've got the vaccine, they're the ones dealing with really angry customers. They're more likely to take that abuse, et cetera. So by hearing about all this conversation of, oh, a lot of people get to work from home, many of those workers started looking for other jobs, and they've left, quote unquote, the frontline workforce into more knowledge worker positions. And then finally, the third factor is the murder of George Floyd. And that really highlighted and brought to the surface a conversation around the harm that racism and systemic oppression do. It also awakened a lot of people, particularly people with privilege, to this whole conversation and started to pay attention to inclusion and diversity and belonging and racism in their workplaces. And so there started to be a demand. The workers were demanding, I want my workplace to care about these issues. I want it to be more inclusive. I want them to care about the LGBT community and people of color and women. And tied to that is a lot of people of those communities, if they got the opportunity to work from home, they were getting a break from all the coworkers who are jerks, who aim all those microaggressions at them. So they were also getting to kind of see how much they were tolerating unhealthy work environments. So all of these things came together in this perfect storm of timing. And, you know, when we're threatened with life and death kind of questions, it's a huge values clarification for people. So anyone who's ever lived through like a terminal illness or a very, you know, intense health challenge knows that it makes you question, what do I want to be doing with my time? Who do I want to be hanging out with? Is this really what I want to be doing? So that's how we got to where we are now.
Wow, you really made sense of that in a way that I haven't heard much before. And you're right, it is the like trifecta, the triple thing that compound into this big storm. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in another question I want to ask you about maintaining culture. So we're going to get to that next. I want on the same theme, the other thing we're hearing a lot, a good friend of ours, global futurist Dan Burris, he called this the great acceleration of technology and automation trends, accelerated by the pandemic and resulting in the need for new skills. What's your take on this, and how should we begin to think about addressing this?
Great point. And I totally agree with him. You know, this great automation thing was already in play, and a lot of the studies were predicting major swaths of workforces being replaced, and us already in the conversation of what are we going to do with all those workers? Do they get upskilled and moved into different roles? Do they become unemployed? What happens with them, right? So that was already in play. And then the demands of the pandemic forced a lot of companies to really push through some innovative challenges around reducing points of contact, physical points of contact with surfaces and workspaces, as well as points of contact with other human beings. So things that we weren't even questioning about automating all of a sudden became things that we needed to automate. So that added a whole nother layer. And then, you know, orgs either pivoted and found a way to thrive through this, or we saw some shut down because they couldn't pivot fast enough or couldn't find the right solutions. In addition to this, we saw a lot of lifting or pausing of regulations that had before been some constraints that companies had to work within. So like here in my town, a lot of the restaurants just literally took over parking spots and parts of the street to have outdoor dining. Yeah. Well, that lifted all kinds of regulations. And now the question is, everyone's kind of fallen in love with that. And until we're ever through this pandemic, no one is ready to go back inside. So right. That's in the mix. And then finally, you know, I think at the beginning of the summer when the vaccines were starting to accelerate, people were thinking, oh, fall, we'll start to come back together in the fall. And people thought, okay, we've made it. We've lived through this crazy thing. And now it's very clear with the Delta variant that that's not happening anytime soon. So this whole timeline is now thrown off. And I think companies are now having to think, instead of this being a temporary situation, they're now thinking more long-term about automation and all of that stuff.
Yeah, so it's going to continue, right? I mean, this whole acceleration. Now, I remember vividly in the beginning of the pandemic, we reached out to our governor because we were an essential workforce, accounting. Yep. Dealing with taxes. It actually occurred on the corporate tax deadline of all things. And we were, you know, being told, okay, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, 2 weeks, became 4 weeks, became 8 weeks, became 8 months. I mean, whoever thought we'd still be here at this point in time? You're right. It's just, that's incredible.
Well, it's honestly the failure of our leaders. If we had truly gotten everyone on board and people had truly locked down, the virus would have had nowhere to go to. But it continued to find communities to infect, and it's part of why the Delta variant is here. We still haven't denied it of its source of mutation and growth, and until we do, it will continue to mutate and grow. So, that's also in the mix here too, is people not feeling like they got great leadership through this very difficult time. Companies where the CEOs were communicating clearly and consistently, I think workers felt better than when they were left without a whole lot of information. And even, just within the United States alone, we have so many differing viewpoints and perspectives, and none of the governors are aligned, and it's a mess. And globally, it's a mess.
It's a hot mess. So interesting enough, speaking about that trust point, in the midst of the pandemic, there was Edelman, who always does this big trust study. They actually said the most trusted source for people were their employers, because they stopped trusting government, right? Because of all that stuff going on. And then the most trusted officer inside companies was the CFO, because they were being called on to project what the earnings might be, how are we going to deal with stuff with layoffs and all, and they were the most clearly the most trusted, which obviously we relished that source. I don't like the fact that we had to have a pandemic to create that, but at any rate, now the other part of this skills piece is many of our community are starting to question, how are we going to train people as automation takes moves its path in accounting, and the basic functions get automated. That was actually our training ground. That's how we learned the real fundamentals of accounting and transactions and all that stuff. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, humans are a learn by doing species. We always have been. It's how we're wired. And so a lot of industries, certainly accounting is one of them, but a lot of industries had those kind of entry-level jobs was the training ground, where you just learned by doing a whole lot of it and making mistakes and growing. So when people want to automate, obviously there's a bottom line factor there where, okay, if we can automate this, that's cheaper than paying a bunch of workers to do this. And yes, there is some savings in that column. But what they really need to be thinking about is, how do we take all of that learning experience and now shift it to another place? Those dollars need to be accounted for. So yeah, you may be automating those entry-level jobs, but now you're going to have a lot of investment in learning paths and learning opportunities to get those workers skilled up without doing it through those tasks that they were doing before. So they shouldn't be thinking of the bottom line like, oh, we saved all these workers' hours. It's like, you got to save a chunk of that for upskilling and reskilling in a new way. Yeah. And some of them may have made that investment into a learning strategy and a learning infrastructure. If they haven't, there's some costs they really need to be looking into. There's great scalability there, but they shouldn't pretend that that's a zero in their column. So
they have to save that money. I get that exactly. Now, so I know you're in the edge of a lot of this learning stuff. How will we train a CPA when they can't, see the checkbook or do the general do the stuff the way we did? Like, will there be like simulation? What do you look in your crystal ball a little bit? What's going to happen in that notion?
Well, it depends. So learning, it depends on what you're trying to teach someone, right? Sometimes it's just information. You're just imparting information, and you can do that with a PDF or a video or a job aid, right? Then they need to see it by watching other people do it well. So that time is where you're taking some of your really good workforce and you're videotaping them, or you're using them as case studies. Then there's the doing of it. And all the other types of learning, until I actually try it, I have not formed a neural pathway in my own body yet, including that ability to do the rote task, whatever it is, but also the aha moments that come from going, wait a minute, hang on, there's a mess here. I need to clean it up. Okay, I won't do that again. And then looking for it the next time I do it, right? That whole kind of experiential piece. So how you get people the experiential piece is, now you're going to have to craft experiences, whether they're virtual experiences or simulations. But But unless you can get the automated side to have those aha moments, you've got to get that experiential learning that teaches us what to look for in the future has to transfer into a different form.
Got it. I remember years ago, we were always kind of playing on the edge with this. That's why I was so fascinated with what you talked about at the association Digital Now. We played with Second Life, and we found a Ben and Jerry's, farm in Second Life that had the, cows and the milk and the inventory, and they would come into the ice cream factory, would make it. Anyhow, that was used as a teaching example by one of the universities because it was a perfect inventory example. Like an accountant could see, oh, here's what, finished goods inventory, that's the frozen ice cream, and here's the raw materials, and here's the work in process. It was kind of but something simple like that was actually a really good immersive way of understanding those concepts.
Yeah, and I think this is where, folks need to really look at who's running your learning function. Learning is a science. And when you understand how the brain learns and how you transfer skills and how you up-level skills, there's a way that we can do that taps into our biology, and it accelerates the process that we were born with, right? We are learning creatures. But you also can have people who can get distracted by really pretty bells and whistles, and learning can look nice, but you're not actually seeing the knowledge transfer or the improvement in skill. I always talk to my tribe. That's, I'm a learning and development professional, and that's kind of who I try to help be better at their jobs. I always talk to them about, you have to first start with the behavior you're trying to create. What does ideal look like? What does success look like? And then you build backwards from there. What is the habit that needs to be in place? What's the deliberate practice and repetitions that get them there? And then how do I create a learning experience that has the aha moments, that has them understand the why and the how? So you really have to start backwards from what you want and then get to how do you design the learning to create that. There's a lot of people out there that are talented at it. But I also get a little worried that sometimes folks are, oh, we made this really cool online simulation game. Well, if it doesn't have the right elements in it, it's not going to get you the results that you want.
Transferring learning.
Yeah.
All right. But I knew you'd be awesome. This is awesome. We're covering all this. So now let's go to this other top issue. This is the idea, and our finance group has consistently said, one of the number ones, before talent rose up in the last 2 months, the number one issue was maintaining culture in a remote hybrid work environment. And I know you have a white paper. We're going to put a link to it. The Hybrid Workplace Report 2021, the unprecedented opportunity to revolutionize work. And you had 5 big challenges and 3 steps to this winning hybrid experience. Can you give us a little more insight into that report for us? What should we be doing to help figure out this remote culture thing?
Yeah, so some of it I already talked about kind of in our opening question, which were some of the big themes, right? So inclusion and belonging is a big theme that came out of the data. Understanding that work from home created this leveling experience, but it also exposed what's kind of wrong with some of our workplaces. So some of the interesting topics that came out of the report was, first of all, in the middle of the report, we were in the middle of the pandemic, and the 20% of the respondents had already changed jobs. And now the data showing that around 40 to 50% of workers today are looking for a new job. So buckle up. This you've got to be prepared for a whole huge hiring phase here. And that means that you need to be quickly and heavily investing in your HR teams, your talent acquisition, recruiters, hiring managers, all of that, because you've got a big bulk load of people you're going to have to bring into the org, and then make sure that they're successfully onboarded so that they stay. You don't want to spend the time hiring someone and they leave in 6 months, right? So that's something that is like now critical. Another big thing that came from the report was that what was leveling about it was that before, remote workers always felt a little excluded. They were missing those water cooler conversations or those little informal moments that happen on the way into and out of the conference room. So now everybody felt that. They felt that all communication had to be planned. It all had to happen in a Zoom meeting. And it highlighted, some of the problems with that. Like several of the respondents noticed that the biggest challenge was having, that lack of human connection with other people. It was the number one challenge that people said around adjusting to remote work. And 54% felt it was difficult to maintain authentic relationships while working remotely. So it highlighted that a lot of the connective tissue for teams is in those water cooler conversations where we ask each other about, hey, what'd you do this weekend? Or how's your dog doing? I know they had surgery last week. What's happening with that? So we have to find a way in hybrid and remote work environments to rebuild spontaneous and informal connection. And we started to realize that not every meeting actually produces work. People can be very productive and get stuff done without being in a meeting. So we're having to really rethink when we should use in-person time versus, asynchronous work time versus meeting time. Yeah. The other thing that came out was because of George Floyd and then this kind of disconnected experience, people were really noticing inclusion and exclusion more. In fact, 48% felt that their own voice was going unheard in workplace meetings, and 57% noticed that their colleagues were not being heard. So there's this higher sensitivity to, this is not creating an environment where every voice can come forward, or we're seeing patterns where certain people are not getting heard. The other thing that I think that is important to notice is just we haven't solved remote work. So when we go back to the workplace, we could still have a group of people feeling excluded or disconnected, which is why we titled it, it's this moment of time to totally revolutionize how we define work and what work is. People spend a lot of time measuring work by hours instead of productivity, and moving to outcomes versus how long it took you to do something is a conversation that is really worth having. And yet when you think a lot about our HR and even accounting systems, they're not aligned to measure work that way. And so it's really going to shift a lot of how we think about work in all ways.
Yeah, that's going to mess with a lot of our accounting firms, believe you me, because it's all about measuring hours. And we've been pushing on that for years, but maybe this is the time when we'll actually break through it, like remote work. I mean, It's funny because 2 years ago, we had this big conversation at Digital CPA Conference with a futurist. It was like, find a big challenge you want to think about implications for. And I'm thinking they're going to be talking about AI, or, what they picked? Remote work. And they're like going, remote work, maybe, in 10 years, maybe we'll be there. And then, of course, 2 years later, all of a sudden, it's like the switch got flipped and away we went. Anyhow, that's very interesting.
It is. I would say that has been a great breakthrough, too, because there was a lot of companies that were really resistant to this idea that people can be productive from home or that they'll work as hard. And that's all been blown open, right? We now know that. The other thing that I just want to underscore is that it's a global pandemic. So everything we're talking about is not just between employers and employees. It's customers, it's supply chain, it's everything about every industry is being impacted by how safe workers feel, how much they want to work from home, how much they can be upskilled. So it's exposed some great problems that were already there, and it's just highlighted them on a scale that is going to be good. It's going to force us to transform, but it's going to be painful as we do it.
All right, so you're on a roll. We're covering some big stuff here, Britt. All right, now this one gets to digital transformation, and one of your books, one of my favorite of your books, is this whole idea of they're saying that they're now experiencing resistance. In fact, they're describing it as the employees now, especially even in finance, digital transformation for finance, we're seeing they feel like they're bobbing in the ocean, and wave after wave of big transformation is washing over them, and they're feeling exhausted and fatigued. And I know, we actually affectionately call it sometimes when we're talking to folks about change, we call them cave men and women, right? Colleagues against virtually everything. We all have them on our teams.
Absolutely.
Now it's beyond just the cave men and women, right? It's everyone starting to feel the impacts. You had obviously a book, Wired to Resist, the brain science of why change fails, and a new model for driving success. I highly recommend this book, by the way. But tips, what can we do? Obviously buy the book, but where would we start? What kind of tips do you have to kind of beat some of that resistance?
Well, two things. The first part is in the title. Like, we are wired to resist change. Because we are beings that want to survive, we see all change as a potential threat. And we first look at all the ways it could be bad for us. And then if we get enough information and good guidance from our leaders, we can kind of get over the hump of that and start to embrace change. Unfortunately, a lot of leaders spend a lot of time designing change, and when they announce it, they expect a standing ovation and people to run toward the change. And many of them are completely they do not expect, and they're not prepared for the grumbling and the resistance they're going to get. Resistance is not people being difficult, it's people being human.
Yep.
So first of all, we got to just know that, and it's funny that you call it cavemen and women, because it goes back to our days as kind of a hunter-gatherer species, right? So it's natural and normal, but leaders can do a lot to plan for it. And when you plan for that, you're going to get some upset and some resistance. You communicate it differently. You pay more attention to what's going to activate fear, what's going to bother people. How can I keep them moving toward this is a good idea and why we're doing it? And more importantly, how can I support them with learning and practice and all the things that they need to move through that change and be successful with it? A lot of times change is announced and there's no investment made in helping the workers actually move through that change. Yeah. So that's true all the time. Change fatigue is real. Change fatigue happens when change comes at us so fast and furious, we never get to settle into the new normal and kind of rest before the next one happens. Before the pandemic, nearly 50% of all executives felt change fatigue was a problem in their organization.
Wow.
So right now, we are literally at a place where we've moved from change fatigue into biological burnout, and it's at a level that people have never seen before. And burnout, couple things happen. You literally are just so exhausted emotionally and physically. In addition, you stop getting any kind of positive feeling for accomplishing anything. So even if you're doing a good job at work, you just don't care anymore. You've kind of moved to this state of apathy. And then the third thing is we're unable to have empathy for other people because we just are tapped out. So the other thing that I would say to your listeners right now is be super cautious about change right now, and don't launch any change you don't absolutely have to, because people are so burned out that if you're asking them to do change that isn't well thought out or they can't see the reason behind, they're just going to become one of the people that leaves your organization and goes somewhere else. They literally are crispy, and I can't underscore this enough. This is a time to be really tender and supportive of people.
Got it. So it's funny because I've been guilty of doing exactly what you said. We announce the change and wonder why everybody's not running towards it. So I certainly heed your advice. I mean, it's some great stuff. So let's go last piece and we'll wrap up. Future of learning, right? That's obviously another area of expertise. Just a couple of tips and stuff about this. What's learning going to look like? How's it going to change as we go forward? And I love the fact that we've got to invest more. I love your savings from transformation, reinvest in learning. I love that part, or at least a good chunk of it. But yeah, any tips on that?
Yeah, I mean, learning is something that we hunger to do. And I want to just remind people that we're all a little bit scarred by education. No one really gets to adulthood without being a little bit scarred by our schooling systems. And so sometimes people think, oh, learning and training, but really we are a species that hungers to learn and grow. It's a deep need that we all have. And after we kind of feel like we're taking care of our survival needs and our belonging needs, we all want to get better. We all want to grow. We all want to be our best selves. So actually tapping into our innate curiosity and really believing that people want to learn. It's interesting, the millennials, one of the top 3 things they look for in a workplace is their opportunities to learn and grow. And it's one of the top reasons they leave a workplace too, is if they don't feel like they can get access. So you don't want to be gatekeeping learning. You want to make it as accessible as you can. You want to let people learn on the go, mobile learning, simulations. You also don't want to over-design learning. If a PDF will answer it, don't build a whole e-learning course around it. So you need to just be strategic around what skills do people need? Am I offering them the right content at the right time to keep them growing in their skills? Sometimes I'll go into an org and do a learning analysis, and I find they've got a lot of great learning solutions, but there's big gaps in the journey that they want people to take. So they might have a lot for beginning learners, and then there's nothing for intermediate learners, and then there's a bunch of stuff for experts, and there's no way to bridge the gap. So you also want to make sure that your learning paths or your resources take people on the skill journey you need to take them on.
Yeah.
And typically what happens is if we're not looking ahead to the skills we need 18 months from now, typically what happens is the org has a shortage of a skill they need and they can't upskill their current workers, so then they hire from outside. But if you do it right, you're taking your workers through that journey and they are prepared at the time that those skills are needed.
And that's another point that came up in our research in the finance community was the need for aligning skills to the future work. So to your point, look ahead, you know where the transformation's taking you. What are the skills that are going to be most important when you get to that point, right? And that's what we have to be playing with. So, wow, this has been awesome, every bit of what I hoped it would be. And you covered the gamut too, right? You covered the great, well, what do you call it now?
Well, it's called the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle.
The Great Reshuffle, yeah, because they're all moving, right? They're not all leaving. And we covered culture, remote environment. We covered the learning piece, resistance to change. Britt, this has been fantastic. All right, so for more from Britt, www.brittandreatta.com, BrittAndreatta.com, and follow her on Twitter. It's at Britt Andreatta, same spelling, or Instagram. And Britt, thank you so much for being here with us. And for our audience, thank you for joining us. And don't miss our other Future Ready live sessions, the first and third Tuesday of every month.
Thank you, Tom. It's been so wonderful connecting with you and all of your listeners.
Same here. Thanks, Britt.